What do you think happened to the Titanic that night?
The Titanic was caught out by the most perfect calm. Titanic was surrounded on all sides, 360-degree by icebergs. 25 icebergs,
Wow.
more than 200 feet high, and there was a slight haze all around the horizon, which delayed the sighting of the iceberg only by a few seconds, but they were crucial seconds.
What's the most surprising Titanic fact that people get wrong?
I found during my research, Titanic did not send a distress signal until 47 minutes after the collision.
Really?
I would say that the damage to Titanic was about twice the size of this table. But what you have to realize is the power and force was enough to lift the equivalent weight of the Washington Monument 1 foot in 1 second. What I don't like is people who say that Titanic wasn't properly built, because Titanic was built on a cost plus basis, which meant that Harland and Wolff, they only earned money as a percentage of how much they spent on Titanic. So there is no way they were trying to cut corners at all.
How does the cold air mirage cause the crash?
So I should explain the reason why the
Tim, thank you so much for coming on Today I Learned Science. It's a pleasure to speak with you in this very iconic location.
It's absolutely amazing. Thank you for having me. And also, it's amazing to be here on the Slipways where Olympic and Titanic were built.
Absolutely. And I'm going to just jump right into it. Tim, you have said that you have solved the Titanic mystery that has puzzled people for over 112 years. So in just one sentence, if you could, what do you think happened to the Titanic that night?
I found out that there was a slight haze all around the horizon caused by the atmospheric conditions, and it was that which delayed the sighting of the iceberg only by a few seconds, but they were crucial seconds.
Amazing. And you really did it in one sentence. Very good. And we're going to get into the cold air mirage theory a little bit later. But before that, let's back up into the history. So you spent over 6 years going through first-hand accounts. What moment made you realize that perhaps the traditional story is not as accurate?
Well, it's a great question. So I actually started off just reading these first-hand accounts, and then I got thinking everything people thought caused the sinking of the Titanic, I at that stage already knew didn't.
Okay.
So just to rattle off a few, people said, the captain was drunk, whereas Captain Smith never drank at sea. People said that they weren't keeping a good lookout, whereas I know that Titanic had specially paid lookouts just for that job. And people said that she was trying to break a speed record, but I knew that she wasn't for that. People said her rudder was too small, but I knew she had the same size rudder as the Olympic, and the Olympic turned very, very well. So I started to realize there was more going on here. And that's what got me really fascinated. And I thought, right, let's find out what really sank the biggest and best passenger ship in the world.
Amazing. And you have made a storied career on, say, debunking these more historical stories. What's the most surprising Titanic fact that people get wrong?
Well, I can tell you my favorite
Yes,
one, right?
there we go.
Which is I found during my research that the Titanic did not send a distress signal until 47 minutes after the collision.
Really?
I mean, one other one,
Yeah,
if I may, is that there was another vessel only about 10 or 12 miles away from the Titanic. The whole night she sank. And that's another very interesting fact.
Are you talking about the Californian?
I am.
Okay. Well, that actually might be a good segue into that, because one of the biggest things, what I talked about earlier with Park Stevenson, is at the time, the ship itself was meant to be its best lifeboat. And part of that was going to be the Marconi wireless at the time was, it just extended the ability to communicate with nearby vessels. So what happened with the SS Californian? Were they willfully ignoring, or was there something more going on?
Neither. So what's fascinating about the North Atlantic in 1912 is that only a few ships had radio, and it tended to be the larger ships which had radio. And in fact, the people who had Marconi, as they were called at the time, radio sets, they had a map or a chart of which ships were in the area that night, which had radio. And I'm afraid the Californian, had her chart, and she looked out and she thought, well, that's not the Titanic, and that ship's too small, and that ship's too near to be the Titanic. But the only ship on our chart which has radio where we are is the Titanic that we're in range of. So therefore, there's no point in waking our radio operator. But unfortunately, as we'll discuss later, she seemed to be nearer because the horizon was higher. And that's an optical illusion, which I can talk about later if you want. And also, she seemed to be smaller because she seemed to be nearer. So she looked like a 400-foot ship 5 miles away, whereas actually she was an 800-foot ship 10 miles.
My goodness. Okay, I think we have to talk about the cold air mirage theory
there's
now.
so much of that.
There's so much. There's so much to talk about. So I'll let you lead. Where do you think is a good place to start with that?
Let's start with the lookouts.
Yeah.
Because in 1912, there were 2 massive inquiries into the sinking of the Titanic, which I then read after I'd read all these first-hand accounts you mentioned. So first of all, they had the Senator Smith inquiry in America in 1912, and then they had a Lord Mersey inquiry in London in 1912. And what's amazing is if you speak to, as it were, the officers and the passengers on the Titanic, they all said in sworn testimony, swearing under oath, they all said it was one of the clearest nights they could remember. The stars were. Whereas if you actually listen to what the lookouts said, all the lookouts say, well, there was a haze on the horizon. They say it didn't really affect their view ahead, but there was a haze. And there was one point where Lord Mersey almost cracks it, right? Where he leans forward and he says to the lookouts, well, if there was a haze, but it didn't affect your view, it must be some extraordinary atmospheric phenomenon.
He says that.
He says that, but then that's it. And then he doesn't go any further. And I'm thinking, right. So of course I now have been further and I've really been able to prove that.
Okay, let's go more into that. How have you been able to prove that? Is it a real thing? What's going on there? Yeah.
Gosh, mirages are unbelievably real. They're extremely real. So everyone knows about the sort of desert mirage where you're absolutely dying of thirst and you're looking ahead through the desert and you can see what you think is this kind of lake. Some people may have seen it in what we call the hot road mirage.
Yeah.
And that's where you're driving along a hot road on a hot day and there are these strips of water that look a bit like puddles. The reason why they look like water is because of your brain. So your eye is not deceiving you, but your brain is. So basically what it is normally, when you're on a hot road and you actually see what we call the hot road mirage, that's actually light from the sky that's bending downwards and appearing on the road in your sight. So your brain thinks, well, it can't be a slice of sky on the road.
Yeah.
So it must be water. So, but in fact, the same thing happens the opposite way when the surface is very, very cold. So in the desert or on a hot road, the surface is really hot and the light's bending downwards, putting the sky down on the road. However, where Titanic sank, it was -2 degrees. The sea temperature was below freezing. And so the light, instead of bending upwards, as it were, and showing you the sky on the ground, the light actually bent downwards around the curvature of the earth. Now that's going to be quite hard for people to understand. But if you think of light as a beam, think of light as a fat beam, where the bottom of the beam and the top of the beam are traveling in different densities of air. So let's say that the air near the sea is very, very cold and therefore very sort of viscous and thick and heavy, if you like. Then the beam of light is going to have warmer, less dense air at the top of it. And what's going to happen is it's going to, like a sort of bifurcated metal strip, it's going to bend downwards. Yeah. And actually show you beyond the horizon. So paradoxically, the night the Titanic sank, and instead of being able to see normally about, 20 miles or something, they could probably see from 80 to 300 miles. They could see an incredible distance. But the bit that they don't normally see, that shows as a sort of hazy horizon all the way around the horizon. And we call that a superior mirage.
And is that different to the super refraction theory, or is that along the same line? It's the same.
It's the same.
So that is the super refraction theory.
Yeah. And one of the key things is George Simmons there were 6 lookouts on the Titanic, and George Simmons had the best eyes in the fleet, according to Lightoller. And he is the one who tells us that as soon as they got into the Labrador Current from about 7:30 p.m., He says there was a haze all around the horizon. And that's kind of the giveaway. Okay. Basically, once you're in a thermal inversion where you've got very, very cold sea underneath and much warmer air above, then you see this line of haze all the way around the horizon. And other ships reported this as well.
So walk us through that whole night with this theory in mind. So how did the weather cause this disaster?
Well, you said a very important thing there, because the Titanic disaster was caused by the weather. Now, when we think of great ships like the ones built behind me, when we think of those ships sinking, we tend to think in terms of it must have been a big storm. But actually, the Titanic was caught out by the most perfect calm that it was pretty much ever known. So, for example, when Titanic sank, it was the highest pressure in the Northern Hemisphere. It was 1,039 millibars, which is very, very high pressure. And that is what kept the air really, really crystal clear. So I should explain the reason why the thermal inversion at Titanic's crash site was so steep is a combination of not just the very, very freezing water down below, but the air above at, say, 200 feet high was probably 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. And that's because the icebergs around Titanic were about 200 feet high and they all had sort of flat tops. So above there, you've got slight wind shear, which keeps that Gulf Stream air, which is heated to the Gulf Stream temperature of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, say 12 degrees Celsius at 200 feet. And then you've got below freezing water. So you've got a sort of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius thermal inversion in a 200-foot, height.
Wow. And does this thermal inversion happen in other parts of the world?
Yes, this thermal inversion happens wherever you have warm air and cold and cold surface. So, as I say, it happens often where you've got the Labrador Current, for example, but it happens on the coast of America as well. It can happen in the lakes area as well, where the lakes get very, very cold, but there's warmer air blowing over. And that's one of the things that sort of attracted me to the theory, if you like, the fact that the conditions for thermal inversion are absolutely textbook.
Wow.
Where Titanic was. So normally it would be something like where the land is colder than the air. But of course, with Titanic, it was where the sea was colder than the other sea. So in a way, the Labrador Current flowed like a river through the Gulf Stream. It flowed like a river through the Atlantic, which is quite hard to understand. But if you imagine like a 15 degrees Celsius, quite temperate water with freezing meltwater flowing through it like a rivulet, if you like, I was able to actually map that. So, for example, in 1912, every ship took a sea temperature reading every 4 hours.
Okay.
And for my sins, to prove this, I looked at 75 ships who traveled Titanic's route in the 2 weeks before Titanic sank. And 75 ships, I think it may have been the same 75 actually, who traveled it in the 2 weeks after Titanic sank. And from those air and sea temperature readings, I was able to actually make the first thermal image map of the sea surface at Titanic's crash site, which revealed this is exactly what was going on.
Wow. And just so for the viewers that are watching this, how does the cold air mirage cause the crash?
Great. Okay. So I'll answer the first question first, which is how it causes the crash. But it also causes the tragedy because it causes problems with the rescue later. So it causes the crash very simply, which is it's dark. You're trying to look out on a dark night. There was no moon the night the Titanic sank. So they were relying on really the contrast of the bergs lit by starlight only against the sea. Now, normally the sea horizon would be quite dark, but actually that night it was this haze caused by, if you want to know what the haze actually was, it wasn't a sort of water haze like you and I think of as a haze or fog. It was actually a haze caused by the depth of air that you can see through. So it's quite hard to understand, but when you look across at, say, a distant mountain range, it will look a bit blue. Yeah. Well, that's because the millions and millions of molecules in the air that you're looking through scatter the light. Mm. And that was happening the night the Titanic sank. They could see so far, theoretically thousands of miles right at the horizon. They could see so far that created the haze, this scattering of light in the depth of air that they could see. And that lighter air almost matched the colour of the starlit berg. And that's why they saw the berg a little bit later than they would otherwise. But if they'd seen the berg 30 seconds earlier, they'd have missed it.
Wow. So it's all about timing here.
Oh, it's very much about timing. You see, in 1912, the danger of the ice region was the danger of fog, not the danger of ice, because ship after ship had been through that region knowing they could see ice in time to avoid it. And so what Captain Smith wanted is to get through the ice region before the barometer lifted and before the fog came in, because if Titanic had been caught in the ice region in fog, she'd have had to go dead slow, and that would have been actually quite dangerous itself, because Titanic needs to be going 6 knots to have what we call steerage way. So in order to avoid having to just stop, which even then isn't that safe because icebergs can come into you, as it were, what they wanted to do was absolutely take advantage of the perfect weather and absolutely go for it through the ice region, because they knew soon they'd be out the other side of the Labrador Current. A full speed trial was planned for the next day. So they wanted to get through the danger area as quickly as possible. And while it was so clear, they thought we're going to see ice in time. But what they didn't realize was it was so clear, and the thermal inversion meant that it was literally so clear that there was a haze caused by the clarity.
You would never think that.
In fact, I'll go further than that. I think they did know. But I think they thought they'd be okay.
Interesting. So do you think this was a known phenomenon at the time?
Yes, absolutely. This is the point, is that navigating officers such as Lightoller, such as Murdoch, who was one of the best navigating officers, such as Captain Smith, obviously very experienced, they would have known there was a bit of refraction. And had Titanic's logbook survived, which unfortunately it didn't, it would have said much refraction on horizon, great refraction, stars very clear and bright, and other ships in the area. I found many logbooks from these other ships that had passed through in the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after, and many of them mentioned a combination of stars very clear and bright, which is what we had with Titanic, and haze or refraction or great refraction on the horizon.
Interesting. Okay. And you had mentioned before, as you were explaining this, that this also caused an issue in the rescue effort. So what happened there? That's
right. So the horizon, the perfect, if you like, almost too perfect atmospheric conditions actually caused them to see the berg a little bit too late. And that meant that when they tried to steer away from the berg, they ripped a lot of the ship open. So 200 foot gash. It wasn't actually a huge hole, but I would say that the damage to Titanic was about twice the size of this table.
Wow.
Okay, so only twice the size of this table. Now, if that had been coming into one compartment or 2 or 3, Titanic would have been fine. In fact, if that amount of damage had been coming into the first 4 compartments in Titanic's bow, she'd still have been fine. But unfortunately, that kind of tiny compared to Titanic amount of damage was coming into all 5. And Titanic's design envelope was that she couldn't envisage all of her first 4 compartments flooded. She just wasn't built to have 5 flooded. And because of that, that's why she sank.
My gosh. Okay.
But you asked me a question about how it caused the tragedy.
Yeah.
And it absolutely did. So this raised horizon camouflaged the berg, but it also, in a way, I'm going to use the word advisedly, but it kind of camouflaged Titanic from a nearby ship called the Californian. And the way it camouflaged Titanic was the way you look at distance at sea is by relative to the horizon. So if a ship is what we call hull down, beyond the horizon, we know she's kind of more than 10 miles away. If a ship is within the horizon, and the horizon you can see above the ship, you know she's sort of halfway between us and the horizon, so you know she's about 5 miles away. So unfortunately, with the raised horizon, they judged Titanic to be 5 miles away. And because of that, they judged her to be 400 feet long. But actually, she was, had they realized it was a raised horizon, they would have realized that she was 10 miles away, and therefore they'd have seen that she was very, very big indeed. And then they'd have got their radio out, because they knew from their chart, their radio Marconi chart, they knew that the Titanic did have radio and was in the area. But when they saw this 400-foot ship 5 miles away that wasn't on their radio chart, they thought, well, there's no point in waking up Evans because she hasn't got radio. So at that point, they got their Morse lamp out to start signaling. And that's where the thermal inversion came into play again. Because unfortunately, what the passengers noticed that night, particularly Lawrence Beasley in second class in his lifeboat, was the stars were flashing. They appeared to be flashing. In fact, he says that the stars appeared to be morsing each other about the catastrophe going on below, which is this amazing idea of the stars flashing signals across the sky. But unfortunately, that was caused by the layers of air in the thermal inversion. And when you have layers of stratified air, which you get when the lowest levels are the heaviest, and then the lighter and lighter levels get warmer and warmer, it causes the stars to appear to flash as light basically bends looking at them. And the problem with that is it scrambled the real Morse lamp signals between the Californian and the Titanic. So Californian believed that Titanic was burning oil lamps that were flickering. When Titanic was actually morsing to Californian and saying, "We're the Titanic sinking, have your boats ready," they thought it was a light flickering on the masthead. They couldn't make sense of it. And similarly, Titanic couldn't make sense. Titanic thought that Californian was signaling to her, but couldn't read it. So unfortunately, the raised horizon both caused them to not get the radio out. Then it caused the failure of the Morse lamp signals. And there's another way in which, in some ways, it caused the failure of the rockets, because Titanic then resorted to sending up distress flares. But unfortunately, they exploded at 600 feet high. And that's in the warm air that's normally refracting. And don't forget, they were like 12 miles away, so you'd hardly see them against the stars. So you only really saw them when they got into the magnifying air that was much cooler, much lower down, which is why Californian thought they were just sort of company signals that were very low lying and very near the deck. But their Captain Lord of the Californian made a slightly, with hindsight, wrong decision, because he thought, I'm not insured to go in knowingly into ice. And he thought, there's a fishing vessel probably that's got into trouble with her rudder. She doesn't know Morse. I'm not going to risk the lives of my 50 crew and passengers to go and investigate at 11 p.m. or actually midnight this was. He thought, I'll wait 4 hours until daylight and then I'll go and investigate safely. Perfectly logical. But unfortunately, within 2 hours and 20 minutes, the biggest ship in the world had foundered with a loss of 1,500 lives.
Was there anything else? I mean, the way that I look at Titanic is there's almost like a series of events that could be argued to cause the tragedy. So what else was going on that night, or maybe even in the days prior to that sort of led to this disaster happening?
The series of events that led to the tragedy with Titanic really started from when the Olympic had a collision in Southampton water. She had a collision with HMS Hawke and it damaged her propellers and it damaged her hull. And it means that she had to come back here to be refitted. And that really delayed Titanic's fitting out. So Titanic had to be warped out of the Thompson engraving dock, which was the largest dry dock in the world at the time. And then Olympic was warped into her place to be refitted. And this delayed Titanic's maiden voyage. Now, had Titanic's maiden voyage not been delayed, there wouldn't have been so much ice so far south on her track. So, that's an example of where these things just start to happen.
Absolutely. And was there anything else besides that sort of led to this as well? Or was that the main thing?
Oh, there's so many things. So, for example, when the passengers were sitting down to their first lunch on board Titanic at Southampton. She'd come round from Belfast the day before, and they were there actually a few days before, and they were there and they were having their lunch. And then there was a coal strike in 1912, so a lot of ships were laid up, which constricted the channel at Southampton, which was quite shallow at that time anyway. And what happens is the New York, which was formerly, once upon a time, the largest ship in the world, when she was launched, she was sucked into Titanic's propellers, and she broke her mooring lines like cotton, they said, with the report of pistol shots, as the survivor, the passengers said. But it was quick thinking by Captain Smith, which put a little bit of forward thrust on the port propeller of Titanic, and that washed New York back into her berth. Now, had Smith not been so quick thinking and not been so skilled at maneuvering these vessels, there would have been a collision there and Titanic's main voyage would have been cancelled.
Wow. That would have changed history quite a bit if that had happened.
It would all have changed history.
Yeah, it would have changed everything. I mean, let's go back to the temperature of the waters that night, because that is such a big point of conversation. One of the popular theories is the water was so cold that it would have caused the steel to turn brittle and sort of shatter. Is that the case? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I'm not a metallurgist, and many other people will be better qualified than me to answer that. I have my own view, which is obviously cold water will make metal more brittle. Very cold temperatures will make everything more brittle. So that's a fact, okay? But what I don't like is people who say that Titanic wasn't properly built or wasn't built with the right materials, because Titanic was built on a cost-plus basis, which meant that Harland and Wolff, where we are now in the Titanic quarter in Belfast, they only earned money as a percentage of how much they spent on Titanic. So they got paid 5% of what they spent. In other words, the more they spent on Titanic, the more they got paid. So there is no way they were trying to cut corners at all. Yeah. So they used the best steel and the most appropriate steel that was available at the time. Now, it's correct that when the Iceberg went along punching into Titanic's hull plates, it was the rivet heads that popped off. But I would say that the rivet heads were really the weakest part in a very strong structure. Now, obviously, with hindsight, one could have made the rivet stronger. But what you have to realize is the power and force of the Titanic collision was enough to lift the equivalent weight of the Washington Monument 1 foot in 1 second. Now, that's really like an explosion. Yeah. So it's a bit like a bomb landing in here and us all being blown onto the dock and then saying the building wasn't strong enough. So yes, I'm sure it was made more brittle by the cold water. I'm sure that it could have been made with hindsight stronger, but no, Titanic was perfectly well-founded. She was built with the same steel as Olympic. Olympic carried on from before Titanic until 1935, when she was scrapped to provide jobs for the people of Jarrow. So yeah, it was just that the Titanic's hull failed at the weakest point in a very strong structure. So for example, my jacket's perfectly expensive and well-founded, but if you pulled it here, it would break all along here. And it's not because the cotton's not strong enough. It's because you're not meant to hang me up by my arm sleeve.
Right. That's a good point. And the thing that comes to mind is the lifeboats. It's so common for people to say, if only they had more lifeboats, then more people would be safe. Can you walk us through whether or not that is actually the case? What's the reality of the situation there?
Okay, that's very much not the case. So Titanic did not have time to launch all the lifeboats she even did have. Okay, so more would not have helped at all. The other thing is that most ships sink on an uneven keel because usually they're sort of damaged on one side or the other, or they have longitudinal bulkheads. Now, Titanic was lucky in that although she was damaged on one side, she only had transverse bulkheads. She didn't have any longitudinal bulkheads. And what that meant was that she sank very unusually. She sank on an even keel for 2 hours, 20 minutes. So she had as much time as any ship's ever going to have to launch lifeboats. But normally, if you're the Board of Trade and you're thinking, how do we make ships safe? What you don't want is enough lifeboats for everyone on each side of the ship. See, in a way, you'd have to have a full complement of lifeboats on the port and a full complement of lifeboats on the starboard side to handle a ship that's listing, because you can't launch lifeboats on the high side of a ship, right? And if you've got that many lifeboats, you need too many people to crew them. You don't have enough time to launch them, and it makes the ships tender. So, because the weight's too high up above the waterline. So what they said was, if the ship is subdivided like a lifeboat itself, you only have to carry enough lifeboats to be able to ferry passengers to and from a waiting rescue vessel. Unfortunately, as we know, this waiting rescue vessel never actually came. Otherwise, she could have had her boats ready and they could have done a boat swap, and it would all have been fine. But yes, Titanic had enough lifeboats to ferry people in the event of an emergency, but she didn't have enough to carry everyone. However, what you have to realize is the Board of Trade required, I think it's 6 able seamen to go with each lifeboat for rowing. And so Titanic only carried 50 able seamen. So what you have to realize is with every lifeboat that got launched, it was less skilled men to crew the boats and to help launch the boats. So the lowering and launching kind of got slower and slower.
Yeah. And let's look into the context of the time. Was it normal to not have as many lifeboats on board? What was the historical context at the time about lifeboats in general?
Sure. So the historical context was that lifeboats tended to be used in real life situations where a vessel will normally roll over and sink very quickly. And in those situations, you just don't have any time to launch lifeboats.
Yeah.
So they're pretty pointless. They're a bit like life jackets on aeroplanes.
Okay.
Don't use them a lot.
Okay. Yeah.
But because of what happened with the Titanic and because of public opinion, if not hysteria, following the Titanic sinking, we now have this thing of enough lifeboats for everyone. But in 1912, they didn't have the technology to launch them. So now we have inflatable lifeboats that can just be almost chucked off a vessel and inflate. They didn't have that technology then.
Yeah.
So I would say, for example, Olympic was given a second hull, where Titanic didn't have a second hull. But in terms of safe vessels, some of your listeners and viewers may remember a disaster in Europe called the Costa Concordia disaster. Well, she had less damage than Titanic, but she rolled over and sank in a much shorter time than Titanic. So I would say Titanic was one of the safest vessels. Hull-wise, Titanic was one of the safest vessels that ever put to sea.
Okay. And I think now we go into like timeline and communication of events, because I think that is very interesting as well. So what are the most significant misconceptions about the timeline events that occurred that night?
Well, that's a great question. And the first thing to remember about time for Titanic is it was before time zones were invented. So time zones didn't exist. I think they came in the First World War or something, but I correct me if I'm wrong. The point is that at sea in 1912, ships' time was according to where they guessed they would be at noon the next day.
Interesting.
Which means that slower ships had different time from faster ships.
Okay.
So whenever you're trying to analyze communications on the North Atlantic, the night the Titanic sank, you had to do this really bizarre exercise of working out how fast they were going and when they thought they would be, where they thought they would be, what longitude they thought they would be in at noon the next day. And at that point, you then had to ask, have they reset their clocks or not? Because a lot of ships reset their clocks at midnight. Now, the Titanic disaster kind of started unfolding before midnight, but she was due to set her clocks at midnight. I think perhaps Titanic's clocks weren't changed at midnight. I'd have to check my notes on that. But what I was able to do in my research is to reduce the ship's time on all ships in the North Atlantic to Titanic time. And that allowed me to discover really fascinating things. Like, for example, everyone thinks of Titanic crashing into an iceberg and then, ringing SOS for help. But what I actually found out was that Titanic waited 47 minutes between the collision and sending her first distress message. Another fascinating thing is that people think of Titanic sending out this distress signal and then all these ships hearing it immediately and coming to her aid. Well, only one ship did actually come to the aid of the Titanic and rescue survivors. And that was a ship called the Carpathia. And that had a radio operator on board called Harold Cottam. And what's interesting about Cottam is he wasn't listening to the radio at the time. What he did was he was going to bed and he thought, I'll just telephone the Titanic and tell her she's got some letters waiting for her at Cape Race. No way. So he just rings Titanic and says, hey, you got some mail waiting for you. And they're like, what? So, we're the Titanic sinking. Have you not heard our messages? And he's like, no, I've just come online. And they're like, come now, because we're sinking. And then he has to go to his captain and convince Captain Rostron to turn the ship around.
Wow.
To get to. So, and then another thing is that Titanic's distress signal was 10 miles wrong. Now, a very, very good Titanic researcher called Sam Halpin discovered this. But when Titanic took her star sight, she made a mistake between transcribing the time of the star sight on what's called a hack watch or a deck watch. When that was transferred to chronometer time, which the ship had 3 clocks, when that star sight time was transferred to Titanic ship's time, there was a 1-minute error made. And that made a 10-mile error at the longitude that Titanic was at 42 north. So actually, Titanic's position was wrong by 10 miles. Now, it just so happened, you'll love this, it just so happens that the Titanic survivors in their lifeboats were on the way between where Carpathia picked up Titanic's wrong distress signal and Titanic's wrong distress coordinates. Wow. So it was complete luck that they almost ran over the survivors.
Wow. There's a lot of little coincidences like that, I would say.
You're right. There's a lot of bad luck.
Yeah.
And bizarrely,
Yeah.
there's a lot of good luck. So, for example, had the wind and the waves come up quicker, so the first survivors were brought on board between 4:30 and 8:30. All survivors were brought on board by 8:30 a.m. Had the rescue effort lasted till, say, 10 a.m., the sea was getting much worse. Some of the lifeboats were already filling with water, and it's possible that no one would have survived the Titanic.
Wow. So let's talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about the weather that night, specifically in terms of rescue efforts. It's not usual for it to be so calm like that. So can you describe why the unusual calmness had aided in the rescue efforts?
The reason why it was so calm is because Titanic was surrounded on all sides, 360 degrees. She was surrounded by icebergs. Okay. Now we know this from Captain Rostron because he races through the night. And then when he gets there and he starts clearing up, all the passengers, he starts rescuing survivors. Then he has time with the sunlight. He has time to look around and he counts 25 icebergs more than 200 feet high on every point of the compass. And there were hundreds more than that. There were only 25 more than 200 feet high. There were hundreds and hundreds of icebergs all the way around. And this had a damping effect on the sea state and a damping effect on the wind. So there was no wind below 200 feet and there were no waves in the whole area. And the other thing I would mention is people think of Titanic being really unlucky and kind of bumping into one iceberg in the middle of a clear North Atlantic. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Titanic crashed 7 minutes of steaming time away from an impenetrable barrier of ice that was 75 miles long and 3 miles deep, or wide, I should say. In other words, there was no way through to New York that night. She was 100% going to crash into ice unless she stopped.
And was that ever an option? Because there was another ship, whether that's the California or the Carpathia, that's actually had the Californian that had stopped for the night.
That's right. Yeah, she'd run into the ice. She suddenly saw it and slowed down and actually ran into the edge of the ice barrier. And that's another reason why Captain Lord was so wary, because he knew it was hard to spot ice in the conditions that night. So he thought, I'm going to wait till the sun's up. Pretty sensible if it's not the biggest disaster in maritime history.
Let's talk about the ship's design, because we've gone through some of the other questions. So let's go talk about how did the ship's design either help or hinder the sinking efforts?
Only helped.
Okay.
I mean, you could say it hindered in the sense that she didn't have a double hull, but it was not normal for civilian vessels to have double hulls in 1912. It helped that she didn't have a longitudinal bulkhead, so she remained very stable with her transverse bulkheads. People say that it didn't help that the watertight bulkheads didn't go high enough, but actually then you have to have watertight decks, and that makes things very difficult. And if you look at ships that were properly subdivided, like the Lusitania or the Britannic, they rolled over and sank in 20 minutes. So, yeah. Titanic's bad build was very helpful to her.
Well, that's what I was going to say. When I'm thinking about the ship was built actually, some say too well, because it was sinking so well that maybe people or passengers did not feel or sense that there was.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I mean, there is that. I mean, in 1912, you'd already had the Republic, I think, in 1910, where everyone was saved because of radio. So I think the public were of the view that when we've got radio, we're safe. Also, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews were boasting to passengers, quite correctly, I have to say, that Titanic could have been kind of cut into 3 pieces longitudinally, the bow, the middle and the stern. And each of those 3 pieces of the ship would have floated indefinitely. And that is correct. But what they weren't saying is, if you slice her for 200 feet, then she's going to sink.
And do you think that is the case? I don't know if you've read any passenger accounts where it wasn't this big immediate catastrophe. It was sort of this like slow descent. So was there not an immediate alarm? Because you even said that they didn't do their first distress call until 47 minutes later. So what were those last few hours like, if you can give us a sense?
Sure. So everything very normal. Passengers had gone to bed early because it was a very cold night. And they'd even made sure their fresh water wasn't going to freeze. You know, the carpenter was doing that. So people were in bed. It got to 11:40. And some passengers didn't feel the jar at all. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they were in the stern. The ones who really felt it were obviously the firemen down in the bow with the coal. The firemen who were asleep off duty in the bow, they would have been aware of water actually, coming into the boiler room straight away. So depending on where you were with the ship, in the ship, you either felt nothing at all, or you may have heard it like running over marbles or like tearing calico, all these different descriptions. But if you were actually in the boiler room, on the starboard side, you'd have actually seen water, pouring in above the level of the plates, the floor plates. So what happened was that people were, in the bow, people were trying to flee and evacuate before anyone in the stern, or even the command module, as you'd call it today, of the bridge was aware of what was going on. So Smith comes out of his cabin and says, "What have we struck?" And Murdoch's like, "Oh, it's a berg, but I've shut the doors." And Smith knows it's serious because he sees the commutator, which is showing how the ship is listing. He sees it listing 5 degrees, pretty serious. So he sends the carpenter down to sound the ship. But it takes a while to sound the ship. And then, of course, having sounded it, you've then got to calculate what sort of peril you're in. And the designer of the ship, Thomas Andrews, who was managing director here at Harland and Wolff, he was already on board. So I believe, sadly, instead of kind of sending a holding message, "Hey, we've struck something, don't go to bed, kind of stay alert," because that would have been a PR disaster. I think what they did was, thinking they'd be all right, they didn't want to send a message until they knew, okay, we've had an accident, but we're going to float for, 2 days or something. But unfortunately, when Andrews gave Smith the message, she's going to sink, inevitably, she's going to last about an hour and a half. Andrews only calculated that Titanic would last about an hour and a half. She actually lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was devastating. And it was the last thing on anyone's mind.
Yeah, it's just, you can't even imagine those last few hours. But research that you have done, and you've also written about as well extensively, what are some of the commonly accepted facts about the Titanic that have now been disproven by modern research?
Well, I think one of the things is that men dress as women to escape. That didn't happen. Okay. I think it came from a myth where one boy was given a hat of a girl, and they said, now he's a girl, she can go. And this came from the fact in 1912 you were a man if you were 13 or over. Wow. This is another, brings me on to another huge myth. People say the third class were kept locked below. Absolutely they weren't. So just to explain that, when the men of first class in the bow were trying to get through the gates, that was before they knew they were going to sink. And those gates were not allowed to be open, except in an emergency. So it was only at midnight, when they realized it was an emergency, that they were allowed, for immigration reasons, they were allowed then to open the gates. Now, that was still an hour and 20 minutes before the Titanic sank, right? There was still plenty of time to get into lifeboats at that stage. They also sent first class stewards down to third class and back to third class to help get people into the boats. Okay. So then people say, oh, well, if that's the case, then why did so many more people die in third class than first and second? And the answer is very simple, because they had bigger families. Simple. So a lot of the first class were traveling alone on business. A lot of the second class traveling alone on business. For first class, it was easier to get to lifeboats because their deck had lifeboats. But nevertheless, a lot of third class elected to stay together. And so, for example, the Goodwin family, it's very tragic. There were 8 of them, but because they had children that were 13 and below, and also sort of children that were more adult, up to teenagers, they just decided they stay together. And the other reason is socioeconomic, which is that a first or second class woman can survive the sinking of the Titanic, whereas a third class lady can't survive without her husband.
So it's just like the cultural and societal.
Yeah, they'd rather stay. Yeah, they would rather stay together as a family than be split up.
Wow, it's really tragic. Let's talk about the wreck site. So now that we've gone, especially now in these last decade, let's say, we've learned so much more about the wreck site. From your perspective and your research, what has shifted or changed for you about the Titanic story from learning more about the wreck site?
Well, of course, one or two people like Jack Thayer, who Jack Dawson is based on in the film, said that Titanic broke in half when she sank. But people like Charles Lightoller were adamant that she didn't. And what we found out when Bob Ballard found the wreck in September 1985, we found out that she was indeed lying peacefully on the Atlantic seabed, several hundred feet apart. The bow had really equalized, so she was full of water before she ripped off the keel, and said she just plowed into the ground. But then the stern had been full of air, basically, and as she kited down, it ripped off her decks. And really, it's like two different wreck sites, because the stern is like a bomb's gone off, whereas the bow is kind of like, how you'd imagine a sort of Hollywood film.
Yeah, very interesting. What was the mindset of the passengers like after the collision?
Well, that's a good question. So really, until midnight, remember Titanic struck at 11:40, until midnight, there was not even any distress warning about people coming up with their life belts on or anything like that. So by about 12:20, which is 40 minutes after the sinking, passengers were being politely asked, would they get into lifeboats? But what's amazing to us with hindsight, is that everyone regarded the Titanic as way safer than a very small wooden lifeboat on the North Atlantic. And one of my favorite stories is there was a really glamorous actress called Dorothy Gibson, who was traveling alone on Titanic. And she had loads of these male chaperones because they sort of all said, oh, we'll help you if anything happens, sort of thing. And one of her favorites, Edward Kent, meets her on the first class staircase as she's going up to get into a lifeboat. And she says, oh, it's a real bore. They're making us get into lifeboats. And she says, look, I've got this ivory and gold miniature painting of my mother, which is the most precious thing I own. So please, would you look after it on Titanic? Because I don't want to lose it in the lifeboat, right? So she gives this ivory miniature to Kent and gets him a lifeboat, being very brave and thinking it's all pointless. And everyone says, you'll be back on board for breakfast. Of course, then to her utter amazement, Titanic sinks. Kent is drowned on Titanic, and his body is recovered by a cable-laying ship a couple of weeks later. And in his pocket, they find the locket, which they recognize from the back of it, from the inscription, is actually Dorothy Gibson's. Wow. So it gets posted back to her. So he does end up saving the locket for her, but not in the way that she...
Oh my gosh.
She figured.
But I was going to ask you, for people who dismiss your theory, don't believe it, how would you respond to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is they may be right, because I wasn't there. I wasn't there. And it was sure as heck, it was very difficult to see that night. So whilst I know that the Mirage stuff absolutely caused the tragedy, it absolutely caused all the problems with the Californian and why she didn't come to the aid, I believe it caused the collision because Fleet and Lee said the berg was a dark mass that came through that haze. Now, there's a thing called the failure of color constancy, which is all about relative color. And for the berg, we know was not dark. We know the berg was white because when she came in the lights of the bridge, she was just glistening, brilliant white. But the lookout said it was a dark mass that came through that haze. And that showed they were looking at a haze that was lighter than a light iceberg. And of course, we know from all the other ships from the haze. So no, I'm still happy for others to have an open mind. What I would say to people who dismiss my theory is don't dismiss it, properly understand it.
Fair enough. Amazing. And I have one final question for you. What Titanic myth refuses to die despite overwhelming evidence against it?
I think one of them is that she was trying to break a record. Now, the reason why that myth persists is that it's almost not a myth because Titanic was actually in a race, but she was in a race with her sister. She was trying to beat her sister's maiden voyage arrival time into New York, and she was going to win. She was going to get in several hours before Olympic did, because she had perfect conditions, plus her engines, because they kind of practiced on Olympic. Harland and Wolff, where we are now, they just knew more about how to settle her engines in better for Titanic and how to look after the engines. So basically, Titanic's run was going better than Olympics.
Interesting. And before we close, is there anything that I didn't get to ask you that you would like to share? Anything about your work or that you'd like people to know?
No, I think it's very kind. If people want to learn more, I've got a little website called www.timmaltin.com. And I've written 3 books on the Titanic. One of them is catchily called 101 Things You Thought You Knew About the Titanic But Didn't. One of them is called A Very Deceiving Night, and that's all about the science of what we've been talking about today. And there's another one by Viking Penguin called First Accounts, and that's where if people just want to start off just with some first accounts, leave the science behind, park the science, then I recommend that.
Is there anything that you can tell us about the 101 things you didn't know? Maybe just maybe your top 3 from there.
I think I've probably touched on some of my top 3, but I think for me it's the fact that the Californian was within sight of Titanic all night. They didn't send a distress message for 47 minutes. And also, in my view, Titanic was one of the safest ships that ever put to sea.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tim Maltin, for coming on Today Learn Science. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Stay tuned for a final episode in our epic 3-part Titanic series, where I speak with Park Stevenson, engineer, naval officer, and James Cameron's Titanic advisor, who tells us what Titanic is still hiding. Make sure to subscribe and turn notifications on, because that episode drops next week.